All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 29, Section 3, The Civil Rights Movement Marches On. So in the previous sections, 29.1 and 29.2, we talked about the presidencies of Kennedy and Johnson, and really the civil rights movement from a top kind of down approach. That is, what types of laws were being passed by Congress, what were the positions by the executive branch, what did the Supreme Court say. But a lot of the movements, or a lot of the action behind the civil rights movement, was what we call grassroots, which means from the bottom to the top. So this is the actions of like everyday people that really put pressure on Congress, put pressure on President Johnson and President Kennedy to make sure that the right laws do get passed, right? Change from the bottom up. So just to review a little bit of what we've talked about previously, Brown versus Board, 1954, overturned Supreme Court ruling. The case of Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. This was the Supreme Court case that ruled separate but equal. The Supreme Court case Brown versus Board in 1954 said no, separate is inherently unequal. So it made, technically what the court applied to was segregation in public schools and made that illegal. But then we learned that even though the Supreme Court made that decision, it was still a matter of would that actually be practiced by schools across the country, particularly in the South. And in some areas, it came to confrontation, like that in Little Rock with the case of the Little Rock Nine. And in some areas, schools still refuse to integrate, that is to dismantle the segregationist public school system. And so it kind of dragged on for a while after that ruling had taken place. We also talked about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which was kind of a really good example of a grassroots movement in Montgomery, Alabama. African Americans boycotted the segregated bus system. This was the story of Rosa Parks. It was a nonviolent use of civil disobedience as a way of dismantling the system of segregation. A leader emerged of the movement. Martin Luther King Jr. came out of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and most importantly, those who were protesting the bus system there were victorious, and Montgomery was forced to integrate their buses. So these were some of the early victories, you might say, for the civil rights movement. But by the 1960s, it had seemed that this was going, for many, too slow. And so there was really an urge by the grassroots, by people, to speed up this process. They weren't satisfied with the pace that civil rights was going. And so there are two major movements that sort of show this in action. The first one is the sit-in movement. This is where people, mostly African Americans, quote unquote, sit in on segregated, right? This would mean white only, lunch counters. And this started in the 1960s in North Carolina when 4 students sat at the all-white section of the lunch counter. And it sparked off into a number of sit-ins that went across the country. And in some areas, you had the police come and arrest those activists and protesters who were working to get the lunch counters desegregated. Sometimes they were even assaulted and beaten up as a result of that. But this pushed the issue of civil rights more to the forefront of what you might call American media or American news at the time. Images of students being beaten up at lunch counters was shocking for a lot of audiences, especially in the North. New organizations formed like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. This mostly consisted of college students who wanted to challenge the system of segregation. The Freedom Rides, these were efforts to ride desegregated buses throughout the South. So in the 1940s, the Supreme Court had ruled that you could not segregate, that is, separate white and black, on interstate buses. That was buses that traveled from state to state. And so the Freedom Riders went out to test this, to make sure that the Supreme Court ruling was being upheld. And so they jumped on a bus in Virginia and had planned to ride throughout the South to make sure that the law was being abided by. Because, like I mentioned before, in the case of Brown versus Board, it's one thing for the law to say that it's, or for the Supreme Court to rule on a particular issue. It's another thing for it to actually happen. And so these freedom rides were especially dangerous. They were especially confrontational. Both the freedom rides and the sit-ins were confrontational. And the freedom rides themselves were met with violence. A number of them were hospitalized. One of the buses was caught on fire with the firebomb. And eventually this forced President Kennedy to send in federal troops to rescue, the Freedom Riders. So, violence in this case. The Freedom Riders were organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. They took a much more confrontational approach. Even so much so that people like Martin Luther King Jr. were a little bit uneasy with the idea of the freedom rides, that this was just too dangerous to occur. But those individuals risked their life and limb in order to bring this to the forefront of American politics. All of this activism, whether or not it was in the courtroom, by the NAACP, Montgomery, sit-ins across the country, culminated into the March on Washington, which at the time was the largest political demonstration in American history. Again, Washington, D.C. that's what we're talking about, Washington here, not the state of Washington, but Washington, D.C., was where President Kennedy asked Congress for a law on civil rights. And so you had massive crowds that turned out in Washington, D.C., to pressure Congress to pass civil rights legislation. Of course, the slogan was free by 63, 64, 65, of course. That actually marks when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act was passed. But the slogan during the Civil Rights Movement was free by 63. This was also, of course, it was a centennial of the Civil War, Civil War ended in 1865, so it was coming on the 100-year anniversary of that. It's where this March on Washington that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, MLK, probably his most famous speech. His organization was the SCLC, which was a little bit different than, groups like SNCC, which were much more about college students, or Congress of Racial Equality, who were much more confrontational. This was much more religious. Religion played a big role for Martin Luther King in the way that he talked about civil rights and talked about things like equality before the eyes of God, etc., etc. One of his most significant protests, or one of the most significant protests, was in Birmingham, Alabama. It was called the capital of segregation in the United States. Here it was met, or Martin Luther King Jr. and protesters were met with violence. This was broadcasted on TV. You may or may not have seen such images. People being shot with fire hoses, police dogs, biting protesters. And these sorts of images that were being broadcasted on TV not only reached a lot of audiences in America, but also reached audiences around the world. And so when we talk about President Kennedy having to confront civil rights in order to battle the Cold War, this is exactly what we're talking about. Images of people being shot with fire hoses in Birmingham, Alabama is not doing the good job of winning the hearts and minds of people around the world. It was during this protest that Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested. He was arrested many, many, many times in his life, probably spent half of his life in jail. But he wrote one of his most famous letters, letter from a Birmingham jail, which he really criticized white preachers mostly. I mean, he talks about other things in there as well, but the idea that you had white preachers out there who claimed to be speaking the word of God, but also practicing segregation on the other hand. And of course, all of this grassroots activism was successful in getting the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. After that was passed, it was a question about voting rights, of course. And so further grassroots movements included the Freedom Summer, which was Northerners going to the South to help African Americans vote. time. That was the Freedom Summer. There was violence. There were at least three people were murdered, Northerners. During this, Fannie Lou Hamer gave a speech, really compelling speech. I believe it was the Democratic National Convention, I want to say, in 1964. Fannie Lou Hamer was a black woman. She simply went, I believe, on national TV and gave a speech simply about all the struggles that she ran into while voting, and it really helped kind of capture an audience. And of course, these things, the Freedom Summer, the speech by Fannie Lou Hamer, ultimately helped culminate in getting the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Again, this is grassroots activism helping get that passed. Tragically, though, in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and that was a catalyst for a lot of anger and a lot of protests and a lot of frustration, you might say. Urban riots broke out in the wake or the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. But even before that, you had riots breaking out in places like Watts, Los Angeles. I believe this was 1964-ish, I want to say. But these were riots that were exposing a lot more of the racial. Actually, I don't know. 1968. Actually, I could probably just look that up. 1965. So I was off by 1 year. 1965. Which exposed more of the racial divisions. At the time of the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of people in the United States had expected, kind of race relations to improve, but that wasn't really the case in a lot of areas. What the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act did was to address the problems of legal discrimination, whether it was voting, employment, public accommodations, whatever else it was. Those laws really didn't address a lot of the other underlying racial issues, and those, that sort of frustration, you might say, erupted in violence or riots across the United States, especially in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death in 1968. And so for some in the Civil Rights Movement, like I said before, once the Voting Rights Act was passed and once the Civil Rights Act was passed, that was kind of the culmination of what this movement was all about. People like Martin Luther King Jr. went to focus on things like poverty. Other members of the Civil Rights Movement went to other activist causes. But there were still some who focused specifically on the issues regarding African Americans in the country. And it culminated in a movement known as Black Power, which meant it could mean different things, but a large constituency of those who advocated for it advocated Black separatism. This is essentially to separate and be independent of white society. And this manifested itself in a lot of different ways. Stokely Carmichael was probably the most notable vocal advocate of this, to create separate institutions, separate all Black institutions, economic institutions, whatever other institutions that you might have. The most famous spokesperson for this, though, was Malcolm X, who was also a member of the Nation of Islam. Stokely Carmichael also went by Kwame Ture, which was a different name for himself. Malcolm X was originally named Malcolm Little. Little was a last name that was given to the ancestors of Malcolm X, presumably by slave masters. So by getting rid of Little and replacing his last name with an X, that was kind of a way of reclaiming cultural and national identity. Same thing with Stokely Carmichael changing his name to Kwame Ture. That was a more traditional African name. Again, sort of this reclamation of culture. You probably are the most famous person who changed the name was Muhammad Ali, who had previously been Cassius Clay. So a lot of people fell under this umbrella of Black Power, Black separatism. The slogan for the Black Power movement was "by any means necessary," which was a lot different than what the Civil Rights movement had advocated. Civil rights, and which was advocated by Martin Luther King Jr., really committed themselves to nonviolence. By any means necessary means, use violence if you have to. Malcolm X himself was pretty vocally in support of Black separatism. The Nation of Islam also was a way of rejecting Christianity, which was the predominant religion of white America at the time. Islam is a religion that has a much longer history in Africa. And so by adopting, Islam as a religion, that was also another way of reclaiming cultural national identity. But Malcolm X himself had started off his career by speaking out pretty vocally against white society in the United States, but began to change his tune a little bit. In 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by members of, I believe, I want to say the Nation of Islam, but they were members who didn't think that Malcolm X, they didn't like his tone of kind of softening his rhetoric, wanted him to take a much more militant approach to that. Another offshoot of this Black Power movement was the Black Panthers, which were a little bit different in that they embraced Marxism, that is an anti-capitalist view. That was to say the problem the problem of racism in the United States and a lot of the problems facing the Black community is that it's the capitalist economic system that allows for things like that to flourish. So by embracing a Marxist tone or an anti-capitalist rhetoric, this was a way of combating racism in the U.S. The Black Panthers were also notably very militant, dressing up in army clothing, brandishing weapons, a much more confrontational approach. And especially for white America, this was, organizations like the Black Panthers were much more intimidating and frightening than perhaps people like Martin Luther King Jr. that came before them. Black Power also manifested itself in Black Pride, the saying that Black is beautiful, like we mentioned before, a reclamation of heritage. This manifested itself in different ways, from, like I said, changing one's name to converting to Islam or converting to a different religion. It also came in hairstyle, for example. So you have a picture of the Jackson 5 here sporting afros, which was not kind of a traditional hairstyle, you could say, in the United States, or at least in white American culture at the time. And so all of these things kind of came out of that post-civil rights era. One thing that the civil rights movement also helped to do was to raise awareness about the unique problems that other demographics face in the United States. The civil rights movement set out to tackle issues that were specific to African Americans, and by participating in this movement and highlighting those particular issues, other groups like Mexican Americans, for example, also came to, you might say, be more vocal about the specific issues that faced those demographics. Cesar Chavez, probably the most notable activist for the Mexican American movement, specifically sought to improve the conditions for farm workers or agricultural workers. He sought to unionize mostly, right, or predominantly Mexican American agriculture. He adopted a lot of the same tactics as Martin Luther King Jr., civil disobedience, nonviolence, protest organizations, did marches, went on hunger strikes, was successful in creating the United Farm Workers. So this was a union, so successful in creating a union for those workers, and continuing to tackle other problems. Kind of like the Black Power movement, you also had a Chicano movement, which was a much more radical, you might say, version of Mexican American activism or civil rights. It was mostly popular among, young Mexican Americans in particular. There was also a reclaiming of cultural heritage, whether or not that was to embrace things like more traditional Mexican dress or language or whatever else that may include.